You know, ladies and gentlemen, now it's my pleasure to turn the stage over to Heather Gartman, who's the Managing Director at Inventive Health PR Group and lead for Inventive's Patient Engagement and Global Clinical Trial Recruitment Group, who's going to moderate our first exciting discussion on patient advocacy beyond our borders. And remember, folks, this is a day of conversation, so make sure that you have your questions ready for this panel and all of our speakers together. So please, Heather, could you join me at the podium?
Thank you. Really, I don't know how you come after that film. Honestly, amazing. One of my daughter's best friends has Sturge-Weber syndrome, so really amazing. And I'm sure they know about it, but I have to make sure that they have seen it. So we're going to try and sort of compose ourselves after that very emotional video. So as he said, I am the Managing Director at Inventive Health, and I lead our advocacy and global patient recruitment practice. I like to say that I was born into patient advocacy. My father started the Kidney Foundation of Canada before there was dialysis, and at the very earliest of ages, he had us selling unsalted peanuts around Halloween to raise money for patient programs and research. Some would say that Canada is not outside the US borders because we are talking about patient advocacy outside the US, but I know many of you think it's the 51st state, and these days you may want to live there, but with a different healthcare system, socialized medicine, there are lessons to be learned from that. Since then, I have been in the United States, living here 25 years, working for and with patient advocacy groups on a global level in many different therapeutic categories, from oncology to diabetes to mental health. Recently, Inventive Health has conducted several surveys in patient advocacy. The first one, we talked to 42 patient advocacy groups about what their wish list was from the biopharmaceutical industry and how they want to work better with industry. Interestingly, one of the top wishes was to work with industry right from the beginning on the development of drugs. So patient-driven development. That was really interesting, but obviously not surprising. The second one was in rare disease. And as you can imagine, we can't develop drugs in rare disease, as we heard here, without close collaboration with the patient community. And the one that we're working on now that I think is really relevant to the topic that we have is in the area of mental health, global mental health, and we're going to juxtapose what we're seeing in the US and what we're seeing ex-US, and what are the differences and what are the lessons that we can learn, et cetera. And by the way, if you're interested in any of them, please just give me your card. I'm happy to send them to you. All of them showed that there are trends and globalization of patient advocacy, as we well know. So today, our panelists, and I ask each one of them to please come down and join me, because I'm not going to do this alone, is going to talk about what they have done globally, what the lessons are for us here in the US, and how we can all learn from each other. I'm going to have each one of them to introduce themselves. We have Claudia Hirawat, who's the chair of the International Circles of Ambassadors for Eurodis. Michelle Rhee, Global and R&D Patient Advocacy for Takeda Oncology, although I know she is representing herself today. Got that right, Michelle?
And say that okay. I am, although I work at Takeda Oncology, my statements today are personal opinions and do not represent those of the company.
We've all been there, we understand.
Exactly,
the legal and regulatory people, in case any of you are here, it's the bane of our existence. Ellie Strock, Director of U.S. Medical Affairs at Valentis, and Ray Wezick, who is the Global Advocacy Executive from the International Myeloma Foundation. So welcome, all of you. Claudia, do you want to start by introducing yourselves, and then we'll go down the line?
Sure. I'm Claudia Hirawat. I have been in biotech over 25 years now, but usually on the industry side. I worked at a consulting firm for 5 years, helping build some of these companies from the very beginning, actually seeing them be born at the big boom of the biotech years. Then I joined a company called PTC, where I was for 15 years. I was responsible, together with the CEO, for recruiting and creating every single function of the company, including running all business development, negotiated all of their collaborations, ran every function until we could hire someone who actually know how to do it. And among those things was patient advocacy, because we didn't have anyone. And I had the pleasure of going to Aurorda's meetings in Europe, the European Organization for Rare Disorders, for a representative to try to learn what the environment would look like for us at PTC. And really fell in love with the organization. I should say I am a volunteer for Aurorda's. I officially retired 2 years ago. I mean, I really retired. I do not have a job. I will not look for a job.
Would you like a job? No.
Because apparently it's a really good way to get asked for a job. It might be a strategy someone want to pursue. But I obviously wasn't very good at changing jobs. I was in the same place for like decades usually. So 15 years at PTC, worked through raising a lot of financing, running through our IPO, running through the conditional approval of the first drug for Duchenne in Europe, and very, very difficult process, because we had a drug that was a possibility for a percentage of the cases of any genetic disorder, but only that percentage. So only if you happen to have your genetic disorder because of a nonsense mutation. So it was very complicated, and we had a list of 4,000 diseases. So I found myself learning a lot. But in the process, falling in love with Aurorda's. Aurorda's is an organization that represents the voices of patients across all of Europe, and in some ways all over the world, because the materials they produce are produced in 8 languages, so they get utilized in many, many other areas of the world as well. I'm from Brazil, and of course everyone in Brazil gets the materials from Portugal. It works beautifully. They represent over 700 different patient groups. And the reason, after I retired, that I chose to volunteer for Aurorda's was because I have not encountered another organization that are more ethical, principled, well-structured, and actually impactful role in patients' lives. So I'd like to think of him as my boss. Jan Likam, the CEO of Aurorda's, is actually on the board of EMA. They have official designated representation at every level of the drug approval process in Europe. And I think that's just what we want for the US and for the rest of the world. So this is why I've chose to dedicate myself to them. I may not know, as a volunteer, I'm not involved with every single function, and I may not know the answer to all of your questions, but if you look for me later, and if there's anything you need me to find out, I promise I'll find it for you.
Thank you. My name is Ellie Strock, and I'm the Director of U.S. Medical Affairs for Voluntis. I'm an adult nurse practitioner, so I come from a clinical background, and really looking at the whole innovation and disruptive technology of digital health, and looking at engaging patients and their healthcare providers around technologies that help to support therapies. And one of our big areas has been in the whole area of diabetes and supporting patients working with insulin therapy and finding a need to really develop companion software to help support that titration and use of insulin therapy. I think in looking at our company, we have a long history, 15 years actually now, in working in digital health. And the company is headquartered in Paris, and our innovations started in Europe and then are now being utilized within the US. And our headquarters are in the US, are here in Boston and Cambridge. So it's one of those where the European component brought the technology to the US, which is usually the other way around. Really feeling that and learning very early in our company that the patient is really critical, and that technology has to be one where the patients are engaged and involved, and it's not just feeding information to someone. It's got to be a two-way street. You have to get information back. And so looking at ways of connecting patients and their healthcare providers and helping to improve outcomes has been the mission of the company. Prior to joining Voluntis 2 years ago, I was with the International Diabetes Center in Minneapolis and a nonprofit WHO collaborating center. So have done a lot of work in research, patient education, care, translation, of education, of knowledge into practice on a global basis through our WHO work. So I've had the opportunity to do a lot of work in Brazil. And as my colleagues there have said, I've probably been in more cities in Brazil than most Brazilians have been. And then also both Latin America and in other countries in Latin America, and then also in Asia, China, India, where diabetes is growing rapidly. So I think bring a perspective from a clinical background, but also that looking at, we have to think of ways to do things differently, and digital health is one of those technologies that I think has a phenomenal opportunity for connecting people around the world, and then also for helping to support therapies and helping to monitor and manage and guide patients and patient decisions in improving outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Michelle Rhee. I work at Takeda Oncology in Global and R&D Patient Advocacy. It's a newly formed role, but I think it's a wonderful one. The goal of the position is to engage with our global partners, global patient advocacy groups, and then also bring some of those insights back in, engage with the R&D, and make sure those perspectives are incorporated. My background is pretty much straight patient advocacy. I have been in rare disease and cancer patient advocacy for a very long time. Actually, during the next storytelling, I'll explain sort of how I got there. But for sort of most recently, I was at the National Brain Tumor Society, engaging with some of our local patient advocacy groups from the nonprofit side. And then I went to industry and engaged, I was actually at Bluebird Bio, and we have some representatives here from there. And I had the chance to work not only in a very rare disease that had amazing international reach, ALD. ALD Connect is represented over there also. But we also had a program that was in the Adaptive Pathways program in the EU. So the opportunity to engage at that level, sort of one-on-one directly. And it's very exciting to know that patient advocacy is so much of a movement, and that this meeting is happening. When I moved, actually, I didn't even move into patient advocacy originally because I didn't know it was a thing. So the fact that we have it now is fantastic.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ray Wiesig. I am the Global Advocacy Executive with the International Myeloma Foundation. For those of you that don't know the IMF, it's the oldest and largest myeloma-specific organization in the entire world. We are in over 140 countries, and we have about 350,000 members currently. Prior to working with the IMF, I'm actually an attorney, in Maryland, and I had my own firm, and I primarily worked on homeowners who were in foreclosure or were attempting to do short sales with their lender. And my role with the IMF is handling the Global Myeloma Action Network, or GMAN as we like to call it. GMAN is comprised of about, at this point, 40 myeloma-specific or myeloma-dealing organizations from around the world. We have members in the EU, from Canada, from Latin America, Asia, and we're actually currently looking at adding some members in Africa, hopefully. What we do is we probably bring them together. We talk about issues, sharing best practices, how we can collaborate. We've really spent the last 2 years trying to bring all of our organizations up to the same level of functionality. And one of the things that I learned when I first got into GMAN was that not all patient advocacy organizations are really made the same or geared the same. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that later on in this panel, so I'm not going to get too specific into that. But it's really been a huge challenge, and it's also been a pleasure to do that and meet so many wonderful patient advocates and also wonderful sponsors like Michelle that I work with regularly. And so yeah, that's who I am.
Terrific, thank you all. The first question that I want us to discuss is how is patient advocacy different outside the US, and what lessons or best practices can we bring back to the US? Claudia, you mentioned already one I think that's very important, which is Eurodis has an official designation on the EMA, and I think that's a lesson that we can all learn and perhaps work towards here. But if Claudia, or we can start with anybody would like to discuss some of the differences we've seen, some of the lessons we learned along the way, and what can we bring back here to the U.S.
Sure, I'll kick it off and pass it on. I forgot to say, I'm also a rare disease patient. I have 2 rare disorders, a rare type of von Willebrand disease and a rare platelet aggregation disorder, and so does my daughter. And these are very mild disorders, but I think in the cases that I have, it really does help you understand a little bit how very different it feels, no matter how many years you worked when you're sitting there with your child talking about their care. And it is, I'm grateful that we're well, but I'm also grateful that it's given me that understanding. It's completely different. So I'm Brazilian and we get along with everyone. So they sent me over to Europe, this is like 15 years ago, to go to the first 2 Eurodis meetings. I had done a lot of work with Nord and really felt very at home and very comfortable there. We arrive in Europe and it's just like the shouting match. I mean, they are just going at each other's throats in the most aggressive ways. I want to hide under the table. And the person who was with me said, no, that's the way we do it here. This is the way we roll. And I thought, I can't work myself up to that. Like, this is gonna get very difficult for me. There is a level of distrust of industry that I experienced in Europe that is much higher than the level I did experience in the US. There's distrust kind of all around, and I think we're doing a lot to remove some of that by working with the groups earlier and earlier and earlier. But the distrust there is different, and it's more sedimented in their culture. It's also very different from every little country in Europe, because every different one has a different reality in terms of the access of care that they have, which obviously impacts their views. But then when we do anything, as we did an event and we had people from Brazil, that you would find, if they distrust you, you would never know, because they're most definitely willing to work with you pretty much on anything. There is this sort of eagerness. And I think what we do best at Awardis is being very sensitive to, it is not just the EU, it's not just Europe, it really is a very large world. Awardis has launched Rare Disease International, which is a group that Awardis is literally created, but it will grow and become its own entity, and it already has representation from all the different continents, which is fantastic. And last year, we initiated our efforts with the United Nations. Later this year, we'll have a formal launching of the first committee within the UN to focus specifically on rare diseases. So I think that it's different in different areas, and we can certainly expand on that, but I would just like to make a statement that it's okay. We can still find a way to work together, and it is critical in rare diseases to work together, because you can't do a real significant trial or a real significant effort without interacting. The world is so small today. So those are my 2 cents.
Okay. I think in looking in my background, prior to joining Valentis, I think looking at the work that I was doing in Asia, in China, particularly in India, that there's just culturally, the role of the patient is very, it's not well defined, and the patients are wanting to figure out how to connect and come together and finding that role for advocacy, but there's such a disconnect in their cultures about even coming forward with the fact that someone might have a chronic disease, because there's discrimination in schools, there's discrimination in healthcare, that it's almost within families to say, we don't want people to know, because then it's going to affect my child being able to go to college, or it's going to affect my job or my work, etc. So I think that was one of the things that was very profound to me, that the patient voice is not being encouraged to be heard because of these issues that are much bigger than any of us here. It's social, it's cultural, it's government, etc. And I think that has been a huge awareness. I think in looking at the world now, that coming from an organization that's involved in really pioneering this whole entry into digital health, that we have a huge opportunity with utilizing digital health because everyone, I mean, we were talking, Claudia and I were talking about this, that in countries where their infrastructure is awful, they have very disorganized, that technology, people have 1, 2 cell phones. I mean, they have smartphones, they have connectivity, they're able to get out and talk to others, they know what's happening outside in the world, that the power of digital connectivity is tremendous. But we also have to look at it in a way that the innovation can be very good, but it can also be not good in a way that there's a lot of information that's misinformation out there. Try to manage it in a way that is more appropriate. And there are ways of looking at that. We've gone and looked at information, and we're working on several projects in oncology and in diabetes, and going back and looking at what's out there on the app stores for patients to be able to get information and track and connect with others. And there's a lot of garbage out there. There's a lot of garbage. How do you know what is good or not? And there's 165,000 health apps, digital health apps on the app stores right now. So there's a lot of information. Within that, there's about 120 that are cleared as medical devices, which is critical. And then within that, there's less than 20 that actually have evidence. And so there's, when you look at the regulatory, both in the EU and also at the FDA, is looking at ways of being able to understand and how to, to regulate some of these devices that are out there that are actually providing medical information in a way that is not regulated, to try to find those ways that we can do these in a regulated way to provide good information. So I think in the, the networks, we have the tweeting, we've got social media, we have a lot of things out there, but trying to control that information in a way that's providing really high quality, good information and support for patients is really looking at ways that we can find it within some sort of an environment that controls the content and the quality of what is out there. So I think in looking at the world, there's a lot of opportunities for connecting through this pathway, but we have to do it in a very smart and very effective way. And keeping in mind that there are just tremendous cultural issues that I think as we allow voices to be heard, they're being addressed much more readily.
I would say that in terms of patient advocacy globally, there are certain things that are universal, but maybe more pronounced outside the US. So I was actually just speaking about knowing whether a name is male or female can be incredibly difficult sometimes in the US, but then ex-US can be even more so. So LinkedIn and profile pictures become your friend. And in terms of the differences between US and ex-US, and this I had to learn through painful process, I think I kind of lump into 3 categories. So one is just legal, regulatory, sort of the compliance issues. There are things that you can do in the US that you 100% cannot do ex-US, and you would think logically you should be able to, but you can't, and you just have to understand and work within that. The other one is structural, which actually my guest panelists also already mentioned, which is that because the healthcare systems are different, the issues that you have to address can be very different. And when I think of structural, I also think of sort of how patient advocacy groups are funded. So ex-US, there are certain countries where patient advocacy groups can receive funding directly from the government, and that allows them to have more of a distant approach and distant engagement with industry, and I think sometimes feeds into some of that lack of trust in a way. And then third, cultural, and just some of those basic issues, which, for example, data privacy and patient privacy, it's a combination of all of those, where legally in the EU, some of the restrictions around data are much, much tighter. But then culturally, in the US, people love Instagramming and tweeting and sharing every single detail of their lives, including their doctor visits and every moment of their clinical trial participation. And ex-US, you'll find a lot of countries and cultures that are very private and think that doing that is really inappropriate. And it varies so wildly that it can be tough to wrap your arms around it sometimes.
Now that all the good topics are gone. So you all touched on some really good points, and I can echo most of those, but there's a couple of things that I just wrote down that I thought would be important. The first, Claudia, you said the level of distrust. That's absolutely true. And it's still going on. I know for our members for GMAN, we spent a lot of time kind of building that bridge with industry to make sure that they even had an email address for somebody at Takeda or Novartis, which was shocking to me, coming from the US first, that they didn't even have any sort of contact with industry. And there's the people who are making these life-saving drugs. So that was kind of our first bridge to build, and we still deal with that. The cultural difference is absolutely true as well. Ellie, you said that, but it's still surprising. One thing that I had to learn, being an East Coaster, is I had to slow my speech down a lot. I'm still trying to do that right now, so I apologize if I'm going too fast. But that every time we have a speaker that comes in who is a native English speaker, I always sit them down and I just say, we're here, we need to be like way down here, because they have to process the information. This is sometimes higher level information that they have to process. I cannot speak any other languages other than Spanish very badly. So I always tell them, our non-English speakers tell them, look, you guys are doing great. If you have any questions, come ask me. It's got to make them comfortable. And that's a big difference that we've had. Another thing that was kind of touched on, but we didn't really kind of overtly say it, is that the healthcare systems are just different. We have insurance that covers our healthcare costs, and that's pretty much it. I mean, there's some other little things going on, but in the EU and really most parts of the world, we have a nationalized healthcare system. And that creates challenges when you're an advocate and you want to say, I want to change the law. So in the US, we create a campaign, and then we get a lobbyist, and we have this really coordinated effort, and we all go to our constituents or our senator or our congressman's office, and we rally for what we want to do. But in the EU, it's not quite the same process. We can do a lot of those things, but there's an extra layer added onto that, and that's the way in which they reimburse their healthcare. Because first it goes to the EMA, they approve it, great, we have this drug approved in the EU. But then after that happens, it has to be individually approved in every single country after that. And a lot of times they're using different formula in order to come up with a cost-benefit analysis. The government's actually paying for it, and that causes some differences in what drugs are approved where. And it creates kind of a patchwork system, and that's something that we're really working on right now. And then finally, the last 2 points I have is, Ellie mentioned kind of the nonprofits that might not exactly be the best, for lack of a better word. They don't have something like Charity Navigator. In the US, we have Charity Navigator. You can go on Charity Navigator. You have 4 stars. Great. We can trust this charity. We know where the money goes. That is not an international system that's set up. So a lot of times there is, or there do exist, entities that kind of take advantage of that system. And to that point, if somebody were to want to donate to one of these charities, another difference is that not in all countries is that donation tax deductible. So that actually causes these countries or these charities not to get as much public funding, or I should say private funding, because public funding comes from the government, but private funding from individuals because they're not getting a tax deduction from that. So a whole bunch of different things that are all different, and that's what comes to my head.
Claudia, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch a little bit on what Michelle said, because it connects to all these pieces on some of these differences being cultural, but some actually being structural. And Aortas, because we receive funding from the EU, we have very strict guidelines to our membership. To become a volunteer with Aortas, there is a process. I'm vetted. I have an agreement with EMA, and it's taken very seriously. We believe this is a really good thing because it really creates a structure on the assessment of the groups that are participating with Aortas, which is a very large number. And it does connect with a core value that we have, that the patient advocacy groups should remain somewhat independent in their ability to make choices. And it's very different. You send your 18-year-old, your 15-year-old out to dinner with a friend, and the friend pays for dinner, it does not mean that she gets a kiss at the porch or that she feel obliged to a kiss. It doesn't. But she doesn't know that going into that date necessarily, right? What are the rules of engagement for someone who is developing? And for patient groups, just creating structures that protect them and allow them to retain the flexibility so they can say at some point, this is the data that we've gathered on our patients. Yes, we made it available to you, but we're also going to make it available to this other company. That is our choice. You can't say no. So every time money changes hands, I think patient groups, people joining patient groups, have to be very careful to understand where did the money come from, what was the purpose, what was attached to, and what is the requirements. Industry donates plenty of money without strings attached. No open grants that are just for, use as you feel appropriate, and those are fine. But once they start, for example, paying for a registry and putting certain demands as to who controls it, what information goes in, my design team just tweaks a little bit, that's where there's a lot of pushback. And because of award structure, those are situations that our groups won't find themselves in because we try to protect them from the beginning.
And I would say it's been fantastic for groups that I've engaged with in the EU who haven't had as much experience either to engage with your Eurordis or an umbrella group like IMF GMAN, because there are things like simple making sure that you have more than one sponsor for an event. Like that eliminates some of that concern about influence and things like that. And there are some of those sort of basics that if you're a small enough group and a rare enough disease, you haven't had that exposure. So I really like both of those organizations.
Yeah. What strikes me as interesting as all of you talk is, some of the lessons that we've learned outside of the U.S., like being sensitive cultural differences, language differences. Really, we have to be sensitive to those and take those into account here in the U.S. because we are so diverse. And we see that every day in global patient recruitment, but here in the U.S. in particular, cultural differences here, language differences. And that's something we can learn from places like Europe and bring them back here, I think, for sure. And we might be further behind than than Europe in that regard. You talked a lot about different trends and different things going on. One thing that we definitely do see is more interest in patient advocacy in Eastern Europe, Asia, Latin America, which I think is not new, but it's an evolving and recently new trend. And I'm wondering if any or all of you want to just sort of touch on that and what is your experience in those areas? Ray, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I don't have experience in all of those areas. Like I said, we were only in Europe, the Middle East, Latin America.
Or Middle East would be interesting too.
Sure. But the trend in myeloma, which is the only thing I can really speak to, isn't necessarily something that's individualized to each different region. The trend that we're actually seeing right now across the entire globe is a shift away from this being a rare disease that is deadly to being more of a chronic disease because of the new treatments that have come out. Last year we had 4 new treatments that came out, and we've had some new combinations obviously from those treatments, and they've been approved both in the US and abroad. And what's occurring is that previously where a myeloma patient might only have 5 years or so to live at the age of 65 or above, which generally tends to be our demographic, is that now they're living full lifespans. And that's really kind of changing the game because we go from worrying about, we need to get these new treatments out there, we need to get these new treatments, to now worrying about other issues, about lifestyle issues, about being comfortable, about being able to do things that normal, everyday, non-myeloma affected people can do, and that's changed the conversation, and that's kind of the trend we're going into.
And I think another trend that I've seen is that patient advocacy is just more global, period. As the internet has come into play, social media, all of that, especially in rare diseases, it's much easier to find like-minded or people with a similar focus, whether it's in your country or another. And because of that, the learnings and the ideas about how to engage, how to make a difference, how to support your patient community can actually be spread much more widely. And then what's interesting about that is that some of the key patient advocacy influencers end up not being in what you thought should be your primary markets, US, EU5, that kind of thing. They're outside of that. They're in areas that maybe you hadn't expected. And it's really exciting to see that because they can bring a different perspective based on differences in structural, cultural, et cetera, all of those. And that trend, I think, is just going to grow over time.
I think as you mentioned, the switch from more of an acute to a chronic disease is what we're seeing in many parts of the world, particularly in Latin America, Africa, countries like that, as that switches, then the infrastructure for healthcare is really not able to keep up with that because it's much more organized, as it is in the US, around an acute care model. The time, again, coming from a little bit different perspective as a clinical person and having been in many organizations around the world, hospitals, public health systems and things, if you have resources, you can access fairly good healthcare, good medications, you can pay for things out of pocket. If you don't, you can't. And it's very difficult to get that. The clinicians that I've worked with and the educators and the healthcare professionals who are working with these patients really they want to do good things. They want to have that connection, but there's no time because the infrastructure for support, when you're seeing 60, 80 or more patients a day, how can you even have an opportunity to attend to some of the patient needs? So there is definitely a need for that connectivity. I think it's just a matter, when you're looking at countries like China or India, just the need within many of these types of chronic conditions, whether it be cancer, diabetes, any of these rare disorders, whatever, that there's fairly poor organization and finding a few of those individuals that will carry that voice, and particularly with the technology connections, they really do make a difference. I think it's just there's a huge opportunity. I don't know in your experience in some of these countries of what the numbers are. Phenomenal, just unbelievable, the number of people that you think, between China and India, it's 2 billion people, I believe. And within that, it's, and it's so disorganized in some areas, but yet so organized in others, but not around the patient. It's organized around the healthcare system. So I think there definitely are opportunities for doing that and ways that we can make that connection. Again, I just keep coming back to that technology connection because it's what everybody has and ways of managing that and making that connection in a way that patients can connect with each other and talk with each other, and then you're going to see more of that groundswell happening.
I love that point. My husband is an oncologist. He works for Novartis, and he was recently in Japan meeting on some drug, I'm not sure what, but something in cancer. And all the doctors just kept pointing out that in the discussions, that they can never still tell a woman with breast cancer that she has breast cancer. It was just not acceptable. Yeah. And of course, he's telling me this, and I'm furious. And I just said, you don't have to tell anybody anything. You could just discreetly put up websites where you might find information. He wasn't willing to. No, he was just not. He's a very well-behaved Novartian, but I'm always trying to corrupt him. But I do think that some women in Japan, and I know, for example, in the Middle East, I was invited to give a talk in New York about the advanced development of drugs in genetic disorders. But then the sponsor told me, by the way, you cannot speak about any genetic screening because we have these issues in the Middle East of, a lot of marriages with close relatives.
Right.
So we don't want you to make it sound like that's a bad thing. So I said, I just don't think I'm the right person to address that because I'm not quite sure, that this can be really addressed. So I didn't speak. I wasn't comfortable. I didn't think I could come up with a clever enough way that do that. But to get just a little bit controversial, I actually, after I retired, my sister, who works in marketing, an area I know nothing about, introduced me to patient groups in Brazil. And I was amazed at how well organized and powerful and capable they were, and I had never heard of them. And there is a little bit of some of the cultures that just don't believe they're doing great things and don't talk about themselves internationally. So we just don't hear about it, but there are great things happening. And I spend a lot of time sort of in this between industry and the patient advocacy side, so explaining to the patient groups that industry is a great conduit for them to connect with their counterparts in advocacy in other countries. So, and the same to companies, right? Use each other as a way to, who you really believe to be your peers, whoever they may be in that process. The next person maybe is what gets you to the next person. But just on trends, just one big point that we haven't touched on yet, but one trend that we certainly see is a concern about pricing. Everyone is talking about it. They're talking about it, in Brazil for sure. They were in the street in protests this week. People are talking about it all over Europe. In Europe, we have this immigration crisis that is unprecedented in terms of governments really struggling to figure out how to address it. And we have pricing discussions in the US. And what is very interesting to me is most people I encounter don't even know how prices are set. In fact, some of my colleagues at the Reuters that I've known for many years, and I'm so honored that they took me in and they trust me, they don't believe me when I explain to them how prices are set. There is a belief by many in advocacy groups that there is like a secret formula somewhere in the safes of every pharmaceutical company that we apply, and that we actually add up like the cost of developing a drug, and then we do like, I don't know, something, and then like model, and boom, there's the price. So when you actually walk them through, this is how it's done, it's such a letdown. At first it's like, because it's not a very intelligent or complex system per se, right? It is a system based on a reality that evolved for a number of reasons in different therapeutic areas, and you need to understand that. But as everyone becomes very concerned about pricing and really wants to go nuts yelling about pricing on Twitter, I just keep begging everyone to try to understand how prices are set, what do they mean, and what do they mean in different geographies, because different geographies have different reimbursement, different payers. So you really need to understand that to tackle the conversation. But I see that in every meeting I go, it's a point that no matter where I am, eventually we get to pricing. Sorry to bring it up in the morning.
No, I agree. All of our clients are thinking about it, and I think it's true it's different, there are issues in every state in the United States, as well as we have to realize that in countries with socialized medicine, even though it's very, very important here, it's almost more important for them there, because in some cases it's threatening to bankrupt their whole system. So I think it's a very good point. And the other point I just wanted to make is that one thing that we see in Asia in terms of patient advocacy is when companies come to talk to us about patient advocacy in Asia, really what they want to talk about is patient education. So they're not really quite at the advocacy place yet. They're really at mass education, not necessarily bringing together patients like we know advocacy here in the US. Let's do one more question, and then we can certainly take some questions from the audience. When companies, and I think there are many people here representing companies that are trying to globalize their products commercially, are there some best practices or some recommendations we have when you think about, globalizing a product, commercialization of a product globally, and what would we recommend to them?
Yes, sir. This is something that I think given that you're self-selecting to be here, you probably already know and believe in, but engage early, engage often with patient advocacy groups. That is something that as you go global, your colleagues or your company might not be as comfortable with that, especially given some of the regulations and restrictions that you'll run into. So thinking ahead of how to do that in a way that makes sense for you as a company, or makes sense for you even as a person as you're looking at it ethically and all of that. It's something that is easier to do in the US, and when you're going globally, there's at times several steps that you need to go through beforehand. So when you're looking at engaging early, it's preparing early as well.
I think I agree with that wholeheartedly. From the perspective of a particular tool that we're working with the National Cancer Institute, it's a companion solution for a new therapy that is being utilized in ovarian cancer. And this has the opportunity to help patients stay on a medication they can benefit from longer with fewer side effects, because they're monitoring and providing information directly to their healthcare team, who then can feed back to the patients and make that strong connection. I think in looking at the development of that product was really engaging patients early into the development, getting some feedback on the design, and then through the process of using it to be able to get feedback, both from the very strong feedback from the patients and also from the healthcare teams, with the goal of having this product, being available, this companion software solution, as this new therapy moves through the process of the regulatory process, and engaging very early and within organizations. And we have, have had some involvement of individuals who are part of some of the patient advocacy groups and others that have been participating in some of that early development. And I think it is really, really, really critical to have that.
I'd like to link a little bit the idea of patient advocacy with the regulatory process, because I feel strongly that both companies and patient advocacy groups should think of those two as parallel tracks that you should engage in very, very early. So you need to start talking to the regulators even before your IND. You really should find an opportunity to make them understand, why are you doing this at all and how are you going about it, and try to get as much input from them as possible. Same with the patient groups. And they need to be updated formally. You need to create a process in your company or in your organization where these updates take place. They can't be, I'm going to update them because I feel like it, because this is good news. And it can't be, I'm going to call them because I really need their help. It's very uncool and way too frequent that we get calls from companies that are in a bind and they need to really get this help. And they don't have any data in Europe. They haven't been to a single country. They didn't go through scientific advice. They have never been to the EMA. But do we think they stand a good chance for approval? And it's like, no, really. It's thinking of those things from the beginning. And it doesn't matter. I accept no excuses for being poor as an organization or as a company and saying we just don't have the money. I raised money every day for 15 years. And I raised money from grants for science, from foundations, from investors. So I have every shape of scar on my back from suffering. And I understand how hard it is, but you can absolutely get on the telephone and you can talk to someone at Aurortis at the EMA. They actually talk to you at the EMA. It's crazy. They answer the phone. And you ask them for advice, but you also must think, if you're developing a drug, as industry is frequently, or if you are a patient group hoping for a drug, and you haven't heard a regulatory body tell you that there is a valid endpoint that we can actually tell if this drug works or doesn't work, you have a very big problem. And you need to get on that immediately, not like at the end of phase 3 where nobody could figure it out, or the end of phase 2 is often the case in rare disorders. Can't have all these panels of like, it means something, maybe it doesn't, it's just not, we are so limited in rare diseases by the numbers, so we can't get perfect data. It's very difficult. We can't get perfect endpoints. So we really need to negotiate as much as possible to get the ability to run trials and that have meaning, that will be supported by the regulators, and be able to stand together in a room and say, hey, this is the design that we all agreed to. We all had input, we participated in it. And you can't show up in Europe with all your US data and expect them to embrace you. That's what most companies do. And it's very antagonistic, and it's just, you have to be engaged with European thought leaders. They are not one, just one group. In different countries, there are very different beliefs. So you have to be a good student and learn all these different elements of how each country views different things and how the regulators will go about their process. And you need to do that before phase 1. And I think that's just a very important practice, and I still don't see that very embraced, but it will make things a lot easier for you later. And when you have a problem, because we're working in a very hard area, we chose to. Not everyone chose to be born with a rare disease, but you chose to be active as advocates because you feel this is important. We chose a difficult problem, but let's look for solutions so that when we face the problems that will come along the way, we're facing them together. There's the advocate, there's the regulator, there's the sponsor, and we're sitting there and we're equally vested in a positive outcome.
I think to add to that, and along the same lines of what kind of everyone's been saying, if your industry, prepare to be rejected by patient advocates in some instances. If you have a drug that you want to bring to market, and this really goes for just about anywhere in the world that has a nationalized healthcare system, and you only have 30 days of progression-free survival, and your drug costs $10,000 a month, patient advocates have to focus on what drugs they want to bring or testify for. And if yours isn't going to cut it, if yours isn't really providing a benefit to the patient or enough of a benefit to make it worth their time, they're not going to embrace you. And you need to understand that. And that's a kind of a hard truth for some people to swallow, but that is the truth. So, a lot of our members for GMAN and a lot of, patient advocates from around the world, they have limited resources. They're not large organizations with, funding sources from multiple sources. And they have to really focus on what they are going to try to bring to their market, to their area, and they're going to go for the best thing that they can. One of our most recent webinars that we had actually was on one of the new drugs. I'm not going to say which one, but that was brought to market last year by the FDA in the US, and everyone was very interested in this drug because it's proven to be very effective in combination with a couple of others. And it was a huge webinar because that was something that our patients groups wanted to hear about, because it was something that they wanted to focus on bringing to their group, and they weren't really that interested in some of the other ones. So it's just, be aware of that, be aware of what your product is, and be knowledgeable about it, and really help the groups as best you can, but also just don't be afraid to have them say no, because it might happen.
And piggybacking on that, before I mentioned industry should engage with patient advocacy early, but from the other side, exactly, sort of patient advocacy should be engaging with industry earlier on. When I was on the nonprofit side, I would do pipeline polls to find out which companies had clinical trials in my disease area, so that I would then pester and reach out and ask them, because knowing more, having information about the status of clinical trials, any data that might have come out, that allows the patient advocacy group to make more informed decisions, to prioritize, utilize their resources better. So it's definitely a two-way street.
Yeah.
As you can tell, we're all very passionate about this, but we're running out of time. So is there one or two questions that we can take before we move on? All of us will hopefully be here for a little while and answer any of your questions once we're done. We're on a break. Any questions? Yes?
Hi, my name is Ryan Clark. I have a company called Advocacy Solutions. We teach and train people how to be effective advocates on their own behalf. I'm from Canada, so most of the work I do is there. But elsewhere in the world as well. And Michelle, I wanted to follow up on something you said, and you've just been talking about engaging often and engaging early. There's no question about it. But one of the things that I work with clients on, pharmaceutical companies as well as patient groups, is what I call an exit strategy. So when a company is moving out of a therapeutic area and you're no longer going to be in that therapeutic area, and of course this gets to the issue of trust and mistrust and all the rest of it. I get a lot of complaints from patient groups that say, well, last year the company was our best friend, and this year, because they're moving out of a therapeutic area, they won't even return our phone calls. So maybe just some comments on an exit strategy at the other end. Thank you.
I have been on both sides. So from the nonprofit side, had that experience as well. One of my colleagues is here, and we experienced that together actually with one company. And I think the approach that I have used, I've recommended, and I've seen be successful is just transparency and openness from the beginning. So rather than just going in and trying to be really buddy-buddy without any context, going in and explaining, that we obviously, if you think about sort of a Venn diagram of patient, community, unmet needs, and company goals, where that overlaps, this is where we can work together. This is what we are able to fund. And then as the company, if there are negative results from the trials, if you have to move out, keeping that dialogue open and saying, this is the situation. If you are hiding any of that, if you are not transparent, then absolutely there's going to be a very negative response because regardless of industry, geography, people are people, and so you have to treat people with respect.
I would like to also add to that it's not only the keeping it connected with the organization, but not identifying it with an individual. Mm-hmm. Because that, again, from the nonprofit side, that was one challenge that we had, is that you would connect with an individual and then that person moves to another position or changes company or whatever, and all of a sudden, all the work you've done is completely lost. And then somebody comes in, they don't have that same agenda, and they have their own projects, and then everything that you've put into it is gone. And so it's keeping that connectivity at a corporate level. Also, you have to develop the personal relationships, but not relying completely on that.
I wanted to give just a quick example of something I witnessed that I was very impressed by. I was at the Fragile X conference when Novartis had a negative trial that just peeled out. It had just been in the news. And they were at the conference, and they were standing by their panels, talking to these families who were obviously devastated that the results were negative. But for a company that I knew at the time was really trying to be careful with resources to make those many people available. These are the people who worked on the trial. They were not just advocacy or just PR or just, these were real hands that were closed, standing there and walking through the data with patients and making them understand what the issues were. It was really remarkable to see. I learned a lot from that.
Yeah, and no one surprised that one of the other things on the wish list from patient advocacy groups, number one, within the top 10 was transparency. Mm-hmm. Be honest, good, bad, please be honest and transparent. Do we have time for one more question?
Okay. Hi, I'm Kerry Rosenfeld. I work in patient advocacy for Solid Biosciences. I'm based in London. I deal with the European area, and I have a 14-year-old son with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I think that I'm very lucky to work with people and an organization where everything started from the patients. But one of the things that I'm really learning as I interact more with Eurodas and with EMA and with the payers is how can we find ways of qualitatively and objectively collecting patient-reported outcomes and quality of life measures so that whatever the clinical outcome is, so what? What is the actual real-life implication on the family, which might not make sense always financially, and it might not always make sense, corporately, but in terms of, really including the patient, connecting it to the drug outcome, that's extremely valuable, particularly with regulators and payers. But what devices and tools and ways can we do to make it, professionalize it and make it less fluffy?
It is interesting how difficult that area is. It's certainly extremely difficult in Duchenne, and I've been there personally. But I also remember being in a room with key opinion leaders in cystic fibrosis when they were talking about how amazing the quality of life changes were in a certain trial. And they told us that the actual tools to measure quality of life in CF were awful. And I thought, are you kidding me? We've been in CF for a long, long time. How can we not have quality of life tools? So I think the first piece is, and I hope some of the challenges that many have faced in Duchenne and some that we're facing will motivate companies to think that these are extremely important development tools. They're as important as your primary and secondary endpoints. And in some diseases that are so heterogeneous, and it may be very difficult to measure, compare one child to another, you might only really have a good understanding of their reality, and that's ultimately what you need to pay for. How well do you live? How well are we able to impact your quality of life? So I think that the tools have to be developed early on. This is one of the examples of things that if you don't have a really good endpoint, if you don't have a good understanding early on, you're in terrible trouble. And I think quality of life is still very much dismissed by physicians in development. They really enjoy thinking of the endpoints where all the statistics just click perfectly, and quality of life is very abstract and very difficult. That's where the patients really need to step up and say, no, this does matter. We will validate a tool. We'll work with you to validate a tool, but we must have one as part of every clinical trial, especially in a rare disorder.
And just to add to that, I agree. The tools that are out there, there's a lot of work being done on them. And sometimes they're targeted for a particular population of a particular age, and they're measuring one certain thing, and people don't understand how to use particular tools targeted to particular measures in trials. And so this whole area of patient-reported outcomes, I think is getting a lot of attention, but definitely needs additional work and validation for the tools that we use. The other way, they're used in clinical trials. I've been involved in as a clinical person in many clinical trials, and people come in for their visit and they're filling out forms, and they've got stacks of forms to fill out. One of them happens to be a quality of life tool. So you fill it out, then you go home. And this is where I think the types of opportunities we have with technology is to be able to submit and do those forms when people are in their home and in their environment, and being able to push out some of these, these through the use of some kind of an app or web portal, whatever, so that people are filling these out when they're in their own environment and in their day-to-day life. Because that data, I think, is going to be so much better than the data that is generated within a clinical type setting. So looking at not only the types of tools, but how they're administered, where they're administered, and how we can get the best feedback possible, I think is something that we need to look at as well.
I mean, it's definitely a work in progress, and I know that the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative, which is based out of Duke in partnership with the government, is about to tackle this issue. So I don't know that we have the answer yet, but it's everyone's working on it. I believe we're out of time. I thank each of you for a great conversation. Again, we will be here in case you want to answer any questions. Thank you so much.